Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and welcome to Omni at the Movies, where today I'll be talking about Guillermo del Toro's newest take on Frankenstein, which I didn't get a chance to see in theaters, but it's on Netflix now, so technically it's a Netflix original. I'm just getting to it. So I would say that I'm going to do this one a little bit differently because overall I think the movie is generally good, but I will say it is very, very different from not only other adaptations of Frankenstein, but also from the original book. And there seems to be some back and forth as to whether or not those changes actually work, because a lot of changes are made, whether they are things that are from the book but altered, or things that were added, or things that don't happen. Now, the fact that there are changes in and of itself isn't a bad thing, because practically every version of Frankenstein is different from the novel. The most famous version of Frankenstein, the Universal version, made all kinds of changes because it was based on a play rather than on the original novel. And that included everything from how articulate the monster was to Dr. Frankenstein's first name for some reason. So the changes themselves aren't the problem. The question is whether those changes are good or bad. Do they enhance the story? Do they detract from it? Or do they take it in a direction that technically works for this, but doesn't work if you're expecting a straightforward adaptation? If you do want a straightforward, as close to the book as possible adaptation, there is a movie called Terror of Frankenstein that, by all accounts, is about as close as you can get to adapting the novel. But that is not Guillermo del Toro's version. So there will be some spoilers in this one, because I'm not necessarily going to review it. I'm more going through the different things that were altered, and or at least as many as I feel are significant, and asking whether or not they are enhancements or detractions. So let's start with an addition to the movie, Dr. Frankenstein's benefactor. Now, in the original novel, the Frankensteins are a wealthy family, and it's implied that Frankenstein can basically just afford to do these experiments himself. Victor has the family fortune to work with, and he knows how to make all of the things he needs, so he just doesn't really bother with any funding. He just does what he needs, spends the money he needs to spend out of his own pocket. Here, a subplot is added where the Frankenstein estate is basically dissolved for some reason after the death of the elder Frankenstein. And in response to this, Victor is not necessarily destitute, but he's also not as wealthy as he could have been. So a new character played by Christopher Waltz is brought in to fund his research. And at first, we don't know why, until Victor is on the verge of success and that benefactor asks for a particular favor. Now, like I said, not in the novel. It is an interesting addition. Like, was there a need to specifically dissolve everything in order to make Frankenstein need a wealthy benefactor? Maybe not. But the fact that this guy is coming in, and rather than being repulsed by what Victor is doing, he is very oddly interested, but won't say why until a crucial moment. That is an interesting angle. That feels like something that could have been in one of the Hammer movies, for example. In fact, it kind of takes from which of those Universal movies introduced Igor? I think it was Son of Frankenstein. About how he wanted his brain put in the monster's body. That was something in some of those later Frankenstein movies from Universal. So here, it is a rather interesting addition in how it plays out and the rather gruesome way it concludes. So, not part of the novel, but an interesting addition all the same. Another change connected to that slightly, this wealthy benefactor is also the uncle of Elizabeth. Elizabeth is in the novel, but in this movie, she is very, very different, to the point where I would almost say she basically qualifies as a new character completely. In the original novel, the Frankenstein family adopts Elizabeth when both she and Victor are still children. And this is done kind of with the understanding that the two of them will get married when they grow up. I believe there's a line in there where Victor's mother even refers to Elizabeth as a pretty present for Victor. So the intention seems clear if you ask me. However, from that point onward, they're essentially raised as siblings, as brother and sister. So that gives their relationship in the book sort of this weird incestuous undertone. Even though they are not blood related, it still comes across as a little weird. Understandably, most adaptations drop that part. One of the few that kept it is the 90s version with Kenneth Branagh and Robert De Niro, and it was creepy there too. And they do wind up getting married, but because Victor rejected the monster's request to make him a mate, the monster comes and kills her on their wedding night. Spoilers for a very, very old book. In the movie, like I said, Elizabeth is totally different. Here, she doesn't meet Victor until they are both adults, and she is engaged to his younger brother. Victor and Elizabeth wind up connecting because this version of Elizabeth is something of an intellectual who also has an interest in science and doesn't seem all that repulsed by Victor's experiments and trying to reanimate the dead, at least not at first. And it's implied that she is not entirely satisfied marrying his brother and wants to connect with Victor and maybe go off with him, but she rejects him because, well, anyway, she goes back to his brother. But ultimately, the strongest connection she winds up forming is with the monster, as if you'd expect anything less from the guy who made The Shape of Water. And here, again, spoiler alert, but you know Elizabeth dies anyway. Here it's not the monster who kills her, it's actually Victor who kills her accidentally because he was trying to kill the monster, but she got in the way. So I actually don't think this change works all that well because for whatever reason, Elizabeth feels like the least interesting character in the entire movie. I don't know if it's the very, understated performance that does it, or just the fact that she feels so disconnected from events in the way that she's written, except for those parts where she's with the monster. It's weird. I've been thinking about this movie and I've kind of reached the conclusion that if you were to cut every scene she's in, the only part that would need any significant change is her death scene, which doesn't really say all that much about how well she's done in the movie, if you ask me. So, unfortunately, this version of Elizabeth is a bit of a detraction. But of course, when there's any version of Frankenstein, you gotta talk about the monster. I like the monster's design. It feels like It's one of the more human-looking versions. They didn't go out of their way to make him look misshapen. You know, no box head with a flat top, no protruding electrodes and robotic parts attached to him. He's not green, he's not gray. He looks relatively human, just covered in scars and a patchwork of different skin tones. And his depiction is by far one of the more sympathetic depictions, but a really big change made to him is the fact that he is literally unkillable. Well, I call that a change, but it's only a change if you're looking at it from the perspective of being an adaptation of the book. The idea of the Frankenstein monster being unkillable has been around for a while, although, weirdly enough, it's not technically in the Universal movies. It's not in the book either. The book clearly shows at the end that the monster intends to go self-immolate. He seems to know that if he lights himself on fire, he will die. So that speaks to the idea that the monster is not immortal. In the Universal movies, he keeps coming back, but a lot of the time they have to use Frankenstein's leftover technology to artificially jumpstart him. And in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, they actually imply that he's going to die naturally unless he gets an emergency brain transplant. It wasn't present in any of the Hammer movies because only Victor Frankenstein carried through all those movies. The monster did not. There were new monsters every single time. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if Guillermo del Toro got this iteration of the monster's not only immortality, but super strength and regeneration and everything. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if he got that from Frankenstein Conquers the World, because that's one of the more prominent areas it originates from. That and the New Adventures of Frankenstein novel series by Don Glut. Now, like I said, it's technically a new edition in terms of it being an adaptation. Does it enhance or detract? Well, one thing is for sure, it definitely changes the monster's motivation. In the original novel, the monster is motivated by the fact that he is alone and spurned by society, spurned by his own creator, and he wants a mate so he won't be alone. And when that request is even rejected, that's what truly sends him over the edge and makes him think, all right, I won't just be a monster in terms of how abnormal I am, I'm also going to be a monster in terms of committing evil, just so he can get back at his creator. Here in the movie, on the other hand, the monster's motivation is the fact that he can't die, and because he is rejected by the world, he wants to die, but he can't. And that's also why he wants a mate, because he doesn't want to go through eternity alone. But it is specifically the fact that he will be immortal, that he is unkillable. So, again, that's a completely different motivation. And it does kind of feel a bit odd. Like, for the story being told, it kind of fits in with the theme and all, but at the same time, it doesn't, in a way. I'd have to think a lot more about it and see the movie a couple more times to really be sure, but I kind of feel like this whole idea of the monster just having to accept the fact that he's going to live forever, it doesn't really jive with what we know about Frankenstein's monster. That and the fact that he doesn't strike out against Victor directly, and that even his cruelest, most vile act from the book is taken away from him and assigned to Victor instead, kind of makes me think, like, I know that Guillermo del Toro loves his monsters and all, and I love the monsters too, sure, but that's kind of a weird thing for him to do. I feel like he's favoring the Frankenstein monster a little too much, almost. You know, it's kind of like when people make versions of Dracula, where Dracula is not a cruel, uncaring, invading force who only sees people as cattle and only looks out for himself, but instead decide to make him a tragic romantic figure. In fact, now that I say that out loud, this might be the most Dracula version of Frankenstein I've ever seen, but it's specifically that gothic romance version of Dracula, not the original version. So, now that I'm really actually thinking about it, I do kind of feel like that might be a misstep in some ways. Like I said, I feel like maybe Del Toro was favoring the Frankenstein monster too much. Like, he didn't want him to be a monster at all. And that's really weird, now that I'm really thinking about it even more, because the point of the novel is supposed to be that it's a bit gray in terms of who's worse. You know, Victor did horrible things, the monster did horrible things. They are both guilty of many crimes. You're kind of meant to speculate on who is truly worse, and which of them, if you ultimately had to decide, is actually more correct. Like, is Victor right for wanting to reject this creation of his as a failed experiment and not want it to have a mate that can potentially procreate with it? Is the monster right for lashing out at his creator, specifically by killing others to torture him? It's a question that's not supposed to have an easy answer. This movie, now that I'm really thinking about it, just kind of takes all of that, casts it aside, and says, literally, in fact, says that Victor is the real monster. That is actually a line in the movie. It just wants to make it very clear, Victor is the bad guy, the monster is the innocent victim. And now that I'm actually thinking about that, I can't say I agree with that assessment. I don't know. Yeah, I actually didn't expect for my mind to go down this way when I hit record on the camera just now, but here I am. I want to be clear, I think the movie's very well made, very well acted, gorgeous visuals and everything. But in terms of being a Frankenstein story, I don't know. Kind of feel like it's a little bit off-center at the very least. But it's not that I think it's bad. I want to be very clear. I do think it is a very well-made movie. One of the best things you'll find on Netflix right now, aside from K-pop Demon Hunters. But as a Frankenstein movie, I don't know. Now that I'm really actually thinking about it, both on its own and as an adaptation and compared to other versions of the story and it just in its entirety, I don't know. I don't think it's my personal favorite, at least, but I don't regret watching it. I really didn't expect my train of thought to be going on this particular track when I started, and yet here we are. So I guess my overall conclusion is that Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein is expertly made, but as Frankenstein, it's mid-tier, I suppose. It's a good movie, but there are far better versions of Frankenstein out there. Also far worse, I want to be clear, but it's kind of in the middle. And it largely comes down to how, for whatever reason, and I'm sure Del Toro does have his reasons, but for whatever reason, it kind of misses the nuance and the more difficult questions that the book poses. So there you have it. That's where I stand. And if you guys have seen it, share your thoughts as well. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.